Good morning. I'm just going to continue with my new series on the fantastic performance of Fabiano Caruana at the 2014 Sinquefield Cup in St. Louis. We're in the second round, and here he's playing Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, MVL. We know that Caruana won 7 games in a row, and it's those 7 wins in a row I'm going to show. So there's no point pretending there's any other result than a win for Caruana, but let's see what happened. E4, best by test. C6, Caro Kann. Once we've played a few moves, I can explain some of the ideas behind the Caro Kann. So white takes the centre, and black goes immediately to an attack against the centre. White advances the pawn, funnily enough called the advance variation, and black gets the bishop out before supporting the pawn on d5 with e6, so it isn't trapped. So the Caro Kann players like to say that it is a better version of the French, and in some ways it is a better and safer version of the French defence, and it's something that I recommend to beginners. I don't like it. Obviously I've tried it. I've tried almost everything, but no, it can be, alright, at a lower level, it's good to play, but the better you get, the better players you play against, the harder it can be to handle the Caro Kann. So what's the idea? Well, the idea is that black, in a very hyper-modern way, lets white build a big centre and begins to attack it almost immediately. So clearly the move c5 will be coming at the first opportunity to try and weaken, take this pawn, weaken this pawn, dissolve white's centre, and if that happens, black will have a very good position. Another idea with the Caro Kann is that you, in the first instance, the development of pieces for the white player is relatively easy and relatively straightforward. But after the pieces are developed, it is difficult to find new places to move the pieces to. Progress, good squares for the second move for the white player. But here, Caruana plays knight f3, the so-called short variation with knight f3. They say with knight f3 because you can play bishop to e2 first. And he plays the pawn to release the bishop. And Caruana plays bishop to e2. So instead of going for very good squares and then struggling what to do in the middle game, Caruana chooses a more modest development in the first place. And c5, as I said, goes to attack against the centre. The first opportunity. There are people who will say that Caro Kann, why take 2 moves to play c5 when you can play the Sicilian and play the c5 in 1 move? It's not as simple as that, but there are dangers in playing the Caro Kann. I think Caruana is good at illustrating some of the dangers here. So he supports the pawn with his bishop, leaves this pawn undefended, and Caruana attacks that pawn immediately and stops also. When he plays the bishop here, he's threatening to play bishop takes pawn, and the pawn would then be defended by the bishop, so he couldn't recapture. So now MVL defends the pawn on c5 and attacks the pawn on b2 at the same time. So it's a good double purpose move. And the knight comes out so that the rook will be protected by the queen in the event of who's he playing against? Maxime Vachier-Lagrave taking the pawn on b2. There is a variation of the French defence and a variation in the Sicilian defence called the poison pawn variation, where taking this pawn as the black player can be very dangerous. It isn't as dangerous here, but is it wise? Well, we'll see. So, develops the knight, castles, nice and safe. And now he takes the queen. And the knight is undefended, otherwise rook here would be a good move to get the pawn back and to start chasing the queen about, but the knight has to be defended first. And I like that Caruana chooses the most active square for the queen to develop that knight to. And the pawn is taken, and it's recaptured by the bishop, so that this pawn is still defended. If he recaptured with the knight, then this pawn would be undefended, and knight takes, pawn could then be played. So he takes, and he takes, and so now MBL has the bishop pair, and the bishop comes to b4, double attack on the knight, and very much we see a whole sequence of moves where people are doing two things at once, defending and attacking. And so the knight defends, the other knight is adequately defended, but it also threatens to come here and win an exchange. So MBL prevents that with bishop to a5. It also puts his bishop on a possibly safer square. But the disadvantage of that is that white has a strong square on e6, and the knight is almost ready to come to e6. Well, get away with it temporarily, no, since it's checked, but then the knight would still be pinned to the queen, so it's not going to work. But if he gets to play knight to d6 check, not only will black not be able to castle, but the knight could end up being in a very good position. And MBL has to work against that threat, and trying to work against that threat is part of the reason why his position slowly gets worse. So, the queen is chased, and the pawn is taken, and now we can see that MBL has 7 pawns against Caruana's 5. But this allows a tactical opportunity for Caruana. He attacks the queen again, and he attacks the knight, the bishop with g4. Begins a kingside attack at the same time, and there's only one retreat square, and this leaves the pawn on e6 less well defended. This is a common theme in the Caro Kann, an attack on the pawn on e6. And the pawn comes to f4, and now he's threatening to play f5. And when the pawn takes, take again on f5, and the bishop's nowhere to run. So bishop comes to e4 to find a safe square. And the rook comes to f2, great, defending the bishop and threatening a discovered attack on the queen. But, MBL can't do anything about it. He's underdeveloped, he's not castled, his king is in danger, so he plays knight to h6, and the bishop comes to d3 to attack the bishop, and at the same time to threaten the queen with the rook, so great. And the queen comes to b4, and the rook goes to bishop 1 to attack. Queen comes to c5, and this gives Caruana the opportunity to move the knight which was pinned, because he threatens his opponent's queen at the same time. So the knight is taken on e4, and Caruana plays queen takes bishop, with the threat of playing knight to c7 or d6 check, winning the queen. So he castles to get also that threat, and Caruana retreats. If he had taken the pawn. Oh, yes. There is a tactical sequence that's obviously not queen c2 because it's covered by the bishop. But, oh yeah, of course he just takes the pawn on g4. And the knight is pinned, so the bishop has to defend this pawn. If he takes this pawn, the knight takes this pawn, attacks the rook, which is undefended and pinned, and yeah, that's all she wrote. So he can't get away with winning the pawn at this juncture. So a pawn comes to e3, and Caruana moves back, and all the time now, if this bishop moves at any point in time whilst the queen is on this diagonal, then e2 will be check and will most likely have devastating consequences for black. So, doubles up on c8, prevents the knight from coming to here. Well, it can at the minute, it's pinned to the queen. And the queen comes back again to that lovely active square on e1, which now allows the knight to move. It's no longer pinned, and he might now be able to play the move he's been aiming for so long, knight to d6. Caruana, MBL plays queen to d5 to threaten this pawn, exert pressure on this diagonal, and yeah, say if you take mine, I'll take yours. Caruana defends the bishop so that the queen is free to move. f6, I'm not so sure I like this move. But he is really pinned back here, MBL, and it is difficult to find good moves for him. As I often say to my students, in a good move, it's easy to find good position. In a good position, it's easy to find good moves. In a bad position, it's sadly too easy to find bad moves. This is an illustration. It isn't a good position for MBL, who has a piece less for 2 pawns, but he's still under an attack. But he's got to try and break out somehow, and f6 is an attempt at the least. And the queen comes to g3, attacking the pawn, and finally liberating all of his pieces. So pawn is taken and it's recaptured, and now Caruana threatens to take the pawn on e3, and yeah, then it really has got a good position. The rook comes to f8, and it's swapped off with check, and it's taken back. And he takes the pawn on e3. And once he takes the pawn on e3, he's defending the pawn on e5. He's threatening to take the pawn on a7. He's threatening to play knight to c7, and he's threatening to play knight to d6. And if he gets to play knight to d6 now with a piece up, and Caruana's only got 1 pawn now for that piece. So there isn't really, sorry, MVL's only got 1 pawn for that piece. There isn't really very much to play for here. So a relatively short game, and I think a really, really well played by Caruana, and a really fine illustration of the difficulties that you can give yourself by choosing the Caro Kann. But, you know, MVL got his threats, got some good play in the game. It isn't hopeless, and there's a reason why I recommend it to new beginners. It's a very safe, very solid game, but in the hands of a master like Caruana, it can be broken down. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to my videos. Thanks. Bye.